Hey everyone, Coach Micah here, and welcome back to the channel. Today is finally the day where we analyze a negative case. I know we've pushed it back several times since when I first brought up the idea of it, but of course things happen, life happens, you travel from one place to another, and you remember, oh, I actually need to discuss this before we get into a negative case. But today's the day that we're actually going to analyze a negative case that I've written. I'm going to go through it pretty much bar for bar, just like I did with the affirmative case, which you can watch right here. This video will actually be part one of two, since in an LD round, you also have to ask cross-examination questions and, of course, respond to the affirmative side of the resolution. The questions that I would ask, as well as the responses from the negative case I've written to the affirmative case, if we're going to create some sort of representation of those two cases hitting each other in a round, that video will be next week. But before we can talk about cross-examination and before we talk about the refutation and responses that I might give as the negative, I have to let you in on what, as the negative, I would run. And that's what this video is about. Before we get into it though, if you find these videos helpful and they're engaging and you want to know more about Lincoln Douglas or even any type of speech or debate, then please not only comment your suggestions below, but give this video a like and help me by subscribing. I want to be able to continue to create content for you well into the future, and those simple things can help me do that. So without further ado, let's get into analyzing a negative case. Here is the negative case that I have written. It's going to be a similar format to the affirmative case video. I'm trying to work on getting documents like this, including with my comments, into my Patreon, so be on the lookout for that. That way you have access to the information here. You'll be able to click on the links to the sources that I use when I'm writing the case, because I do a lot of research for videos like this, and I want to let you guys in on that research. But when we think of the negative side of the resolution, right, the affirmative side is talking about how diplomacy is more effective than military intervention in foreign policy. And as such, with the affirmative, right, we took a position of, well, diplomacy is good because it's what creates peace and stability through nations, while military intervention creates violence and it makes situations worse, because when two countries are fighting, it can heighten tensions, it can ruin relations, and does a lot of irreparable damage. But in this case, we got to figure out a way to make military interventions sound good. And I struggled with this for a little bit of time, and that's when I came up with a really good strategy. So here's the thesis of this negative case. We're talking about that military intervention is what influences pretty much all foreign policy. Diplomacy is an empty vessel, and it's pretty much empty unless it is backed by a credible threat of military intervention, right? So my idea when I was coming up with this case was, well, you can have diplomacy, sure, but if you take away a country's might, right, their military, the negotiations that you make with another country simply just don't work. For example, let's say the United States had no military. We wouldn't be able to talk to other countries and demand things of them, or say we're going to make a deal with you. That just isn't a thing. So military intervention has to be involved, even within diplomacy. And also there are many things that require military intervention that we are going to point out in this case. So there's three different ways that I support this thesis throughout this case. The first is I define the resolution down to conflict and where conflict happens, and we're going to talk about that here in a second when we move on to our resolutional analysis point. I also define diplomacy, and I'm going to pretty much have this definition that we'll talk about in a second be the definition that I use in any round. So whether the affirmative has a definition or not, I'm going to try to make sure that my definition is used, unless the opponent brings up the same one. Then you can just agree to it. But we'll talk about why that is in a second. The third is that we're going to be using the strength of numbers, right? So, for example, in the affirmative case, they talked about, well, we have to look at a majority rule, right? We have to look at in the majority of cases. I'm kind of playing into that. I'm bringing up in the majority of cases, and I'm going to show you how I do that. But first, we need to talk about the resolutional analysis. Resolutional analysis, conflict necessary. Let's read it. Diplomacy is the default position of most governments. Negotiate and keep relationships civil. Most countries haven't had to make a choice between either due to there never being a need for intervention. The comparison of effectiveness only makes sense when a choice is needed in a situation. Thus, only examples where either choice could have been made works for this resolution. So first, I just want to acknowledge that the wording definitely could be better. And this is a really helpful tip. You might spend hours writing things out, and when you're in the writing mode, words sound really good as you read them. But there's a difference between reading words and actively speaking them. So for example, I would actually argue that this is not the best way to make this point vocally. It's a great thing to read. It makes sense when you read it, but not when you say it. So when you're writing cases, make sure that you are writing them with the vocal style, since the judge is not reading your script. They are listening to you speak. So you want to make sure that your words match your style, and that way you're easier to listen to. But in the case of this resolutional analysis, I'm saying that because diplomacy is used most of the time, what that means is countries a lot of them haven't considered military intervention, or they don't consider military intervention because they don't need military intervention. And the only way this resolution makes sense is if there's a conflict, if you have to make a choice between the two. And that's where the debate lies. So I'm pointing that out in this resolutional analysis point. You can agree to a resolutional analysis point of majority, or maybe you say, actually, we're talking about the minority of cases. We're going to see a response similar to that in next week's video when I go over the responses to the affirmative case that I wrote. Okay, you'll notice I have a bunch of definitions here. It is really important, as the negative side, that you have a definition ready and on hand, ones that support your side, just in case your opponent does not have a definition to a word, like let's say they don't define effectiveness. You need to be able to fill that gap, because definitions are really important. Words matter. They mean things. And if you don't use them correctly, you could give up really good opportunities to almost have a Trojan horse where my opponent didn't define this, so now I'm going to define it, and that whole definition could change the very crux of the debate. So always have a definition on hand. You'll notice that my definitions here I used a couple of definitions from museums and academic journals, and I just Googled different definitions. I wanted to find things that were credible, because here's the thing. If you're going to disagree with your opponent's definition, you have to have some really good reason why. And part of that reason needs to be that your definition is more credible, or you are at least as credible as your opponent, and thus the credibility isn't the issue. It's the real issue. Like, for example, your opponent defines you out of the round. Either way, your definitions need to be as, if not more, credible than your opponent's. And academic journals, museums, any source that is like specifically an expert on that definition, on that term, on that idea, those are what you want. So, for example, the definition of diplomacy is from the National Museum of American Diplomacy. The definition of effectiveness is from a public administration and policy journal. The definition of military intervention comes from empirical and theoretical research in international relations. So these journals, the people who wrote these journals are experts in their field, and they have academic arguments to make. So I always want to have a definition on hand, because that will improve my credibility if my opponent does not bring up one. And you want to hope that your opponent doesn't bring up a definition, because that will give you an edge. And that's what we're all about here at Edge Speech and Debate Coaching. As we make our way down to the value, once again, I want to remind you to agree with as much as possible. When you are the neg, you want to write a case that keeps that in mind. You're willing to agree and adapt to your opponent's framework and adopt it as your own. Now, the reason I have a value here is because if my opponent's value is not close enough to mine, if it's something completely different, worse or better or something like that, then I want something to fall back on. And I need my value, again, to be a really good weighing mechanism. Because if you're going to disagree with the weighing mechanism brought up by your opponent, you have to have a good reason. And my good reason is that my value is the highest value in the round. So let's talk about that. So my value is human dignity. And the rhetoric I have under this is few things justify actions taken by the government. We'll stop there. That's true. I'm playing into the political argument that a lot of parents would agree with, is that, you know, actions by the government are usually bad. So I acknowledge that few things that they do are good. You know, few things justify actions taken by the government, but human dignity is certainly the best. So when a government's duty is to defend its people from aggressors and terrorism, as well as allocate and deliver resources to peoples and allies across the world. So governments do a lot of bad things, but we know a moral government when we see it, and that is when it actively betters the lives of people, provides for them, supports them, keeps them safe, etc. We want our government to keep us safe, to provide for us, etc. And this is why I have it as a reason to prefer, right? It's the foundation of moral government. A government's ultimate responsibility is the well-being of its people. Politics and foreign policy also may require a government to be responsible for people of other nations, depending on the circumstance. We would call foreign policy that tangibly improves the lives of people moral. So I am ultimately making a moral argument now, because if diplomacy is the default position, it's just good because negotiation is really good because we can avoid war. Well, actually, there is a moral responsibility for governments to step up and do something if there are ills in the world. And that's where the case lies. There are ills in the world. There are bad things that happen, and only military intervention can solve those. And we'll see that here in our next few points. But again, I'm making a moral argument. I'm trying to build the blocks to make war seem good, or you know, military intervention and war are not synonymous, but when you think of war and military, it's hard to disconnect war and military because they kind of really go together. So I'm trying to break that understanding down and allow for me to make the argument that military intervention is what drives the world, and it's what drives goodness in the world. And we see that with our first contention, right? So this goes down to the idea of how diplomacy is only conversation and what that really means. So we read, diplomacy itself is a nice political strategy, meeting with leaders of other nations and having productive conversations. And again, here, I'm not saying diplomacy is terrible or bad. It's a nice political strategy. But I also say, however, what do you do with aggressive nations or countries not allied with you? Well, the answer is nothing. Diplomacy cannot include military intervention in this resolution, and thus is empty when challenged. And we see this in three ways. So what I'm pointing out here is, yeah, talks are great, but what if you can't talk? What are you going to do now? And that is where we get into the conflict of the resolution, right? The conflict happens when you have to make a choice. If there's an aggressive nation, do we talk to them or do we act against them? The opponent would say, oh, we talk to them, we negotiate, we try to build up some good relations. But what if you can't? And that's what the negative is going to be asking, casting doubt in the judge's mind. But what if you can't? And there's three ways we do this, right? So the first one is no aid. If diplomacy is negotiating, how do we actually get aid to the country needing aid? What if we're trying to help supply needy people under an oppressive government? Diplomacy cannot solve those issues nor provide for those people. Again, I think I could have reworded this to make it sound better. It looks better when you read it. But the idea here is, if there are needy people out there, let's say there's a government and their people are all starving and they're just really being oppressed, what is diplomacy going to do to solve that problem? It won't do anything. That's the whole point of the argument. So then we also have our subpoint B. Talks fail. I say there's no guarantee that leaders come to a deal. Many times they don't. Just look at the issues the United States is having trying to make Russian and Ukrainian leaders come to terms. President Trump and Russian President Putin were recently at a summit in Alaska. This was last weekend. And here's what Trump said, quote, "We didn't get there," end quote. Now I have the entire context right here so I don't break any rules when it comes to evidence. But he literally sat down with Putin trying to get him to be peaceful with Ukraine, and he didn't. It says in this part of the article, This was the verdict U.S. President Donald Trump delivered after a nearly 3-hour meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska on Friday. It was the first face-to-face meeting between Russian and U.S. heads of state since the start of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Trump had trekked to Alaska hoping to set in motion a ceasefire. Putin got away with not even agreeing on a pause. Indeed, Russian forces attacked Ukraine during the meeting. So, yes, they tried diplomacy. Trump's like, guys, come to the table. We're going to work out a deal. Remember, he wrote the book, The Art of the Deal. And they didn't make a deal. In fact, while they were agreeing on peace, there's literally active conflict going on. So I'm using this as an example of how talks fail. Diplomacy isn't guaranteed. You can't just guarantee that countries are going to listen. They might actively fail. And that's where the potency of this point comes in. And then subpoint C is ignore terrorism. So this, talking about aid, that evokes some emotion because we want to help people who are dying and who are needy. Talks fail is just like a slap in the face of the affirmative, be like, yeah, man, your side isn't even guaranteed. But then you have the subpoint C, which really evokes an emotional response. The fight against terror is impossible with a sole strategy of negotiation. Remember the classic Nixon line? We do not negotiate with terrorists. A strategy of diplomacy cannot even try to eradicate terrorism. So really potent argument here on negative. What I'm arguing is there's an evil in this world. You can't have diplomacy with evil. Like, you either have to let it be or attack it. You have to intervene. You have to go after it. And diplomacy can't go after it. That's not part of the definition. So therefore, diplomacy cannot do anything about terrorism. And you could probably extend an argument like this to communism, socialism, things like that. But I'm really trying my best to make the affirmative side of the resolution, diplomacy, be immoral, but just completely ineffective, right? Because that's what the resolution was asking us. We're talking about effectiveness. And in case my definition needs to be used up here, it's effectiveness is the measure of the quality of output and how well policy achieves its desired objectives. If we desire to eradicate evil, then we got to fight evil. And diplomacy can't fight evil. So these three things, these three subpoints actually go over what I would consider to be some of the largest issues with foreign policy, right? The foreign policy has to include some sort of ability to supply allies or civilians in need. We need to be able to help people, right? That's the first thing. The second is that we should try to avoid conflict through conversation. And then we have to fight evil. But here's the thing, the talks may fail. So I'm basically saying with the affirmative that you're unable to supply civilians or allies in need. You're not guaranteed to avoid conflict through conversation. That's not a guarantee. And third, you cannot fight evil because there's no fighting involved. See where I'm getting at? I'm actively telling the judge, listen, diplomacy is terrible. You have to have military intervention in this resolution. And thus I flip the script and I talk about how military intervention supports humanity. Let's read that. Talks are great when nations are run by governments interested in talking, but unfortunately many aren't. It's both military intervention and the threat of military intervention responsible for the positive change made in the world. So let's talk about this with the first subpoint of vessel for aid. Now, in this subpoint, I actually discuss aid in two different ways. So it's almost like it's two different applications of aid, and both of them support the negative. So you're getting 2 for 1 here. I say, again, the military is the acting force of a nation. The United States Air Force, for example, has had many operations where they airlift aid and supplies to civilians in the midst of war or removed people from similar situations. And I have a link here. What I would do is, in an example like this where I mention these examples, your opponent might be like, well, what example of their... Can you give me an example of where there were airlifts or something like that? And you'd be like, yes, actually, here is a 10-page document that includes all of the examples of these airlifts. Right, so whenever I do research and I create a point like this, because I'm not going to put it in my case, I'm going to have that resource with me right there so I can print it out later, so I can have it with me in the round. Because you need to have it with you in the round. Always have your evidence, all of it, with with you in the round, okay? So that's just aid. Is we are literally dropping supplies and taking people out. That is a military intervention as per the definition that I either agreed to or changed to support my side. But aid also means assisting an ally. The best example of this you can write down is Iran. Sometimes in debate videos like this, I like to include the words that I would actively say in terms of organization. You could write this down as, you can tag this as, put this on your flow, things like that. So the best example of this you can write down as Iran. Just a few months ago, the United States bombed Iranian nuclear sites on behalf of Israel, carrying out a military intervention. And I could maybe even make the claim here that prevented an unmeasurable amount of violence. Those may not be the words that I use, but you see where I'm going here. I'm actively saying, look, the United States intervened on behalf of another country. We gave them our might. We used our own resources and military to go in and strike an angry and aggressive nation, and what that did was actively better the situation. There were benefits from that action, i.e., Israel's not being bombed anymore. And I think it's not like it's totally peaceful anymore, but you get the idea, right? That's why I might not use this whole sentence right here. But that is what I want to say and what I'm hoping I can say. And maybe I will do some research and find out that is I can accurately say that given what is true. So aid, whether it be giving resources or striking on behalf of someone else, those things can happen under military intervention. Rather than talk about talks fail, because we're not talking about, like, military intervention isn't about negotiation per se. I could have this be talks supported by military, and this could be a subpoint where I actively make the claim that diplomacy without military intervention is empty. So if you want a talk that would be is more likely to go through, you have to include the military. The problem with this, though, is that the United States has a really big military, and yet their talks with Russia still didn't work. So I'm going to talk about something different, pun intended, and I'm going to go into the idea of defense, because self-defense is a really persuasive argument in the culture of Stoa. So I say subpoint B, defend nation. And I say, when a nation is threatened by an aggressive nation, I could reword that, how will diplomacy solve anything? Just look at the Middle East. Israel could try all they want to negotiate with their neighbors, but that won't change anything. They'll continue to be threatened. A key aspect of self-defense is the ability to look stronger than your opponent. Mutually assured destruction, the term we use to describe a nation unwilling to attack another nation because the consequence is too large to justify an attack, does not work without military intervention. Okay, so one, I bring up an example of, well, Israel has to have a military intervention. Like, they have to have that system because they're constantly threatened. So they have to be able to defend themselves. You can apply that logic to every nation. You got to be able to defend yourself. But also, and this is, again, I address a little bit of, if there's an aggressive nation towards you, they're going to back off if you have military because of a concept known as mutually assured destruction. And I would argue that at the most, mutually assured destruction is an example of both diplomacy and military intervention. Like, I think that's a really good argument to center a balance neg on. So a balance neg is when a negative says, well, neither diplomacy nor military intervention are more effective. They're either equally effective, like they're both the exact same measure of effectiveness, or they're not effective at all. And there's a different measure, but who knows, maybe a balance neg would be warranted here, and they would use mutually assured destruction as the key. It's like the backbone that holds that argument together. And then, of course, I do a quick little subpoint, and you'll notice that these subpoints are really small. And that's because your negative case should only, at the most, be 4 minutes long. Because with a 7-minute speech, you need plenty of time to, one, be clear. You want to be understood. You don't want to talk really fast, but you want to have plenty of time to refute your opponent's arguments. And the more time you have left over, you can use to bring up multiple responses in your attack on the negative side. So just keep that in mind. My subpoints are all really small. But here I say, well, we fight terrorism. Every effort to fight terrorism abroad is carried out by the military. Like, duh. I'm saying just common sense things. And that's where you really want to get the judge on your side, is if you are on the side of common sense. Because if you're on the side of common sense, it's going to make you more credible. The judge is going to be like, I don't have to look that up or verify that. I know that to be true. Terrorism is carried out by, fighting terrorism is carried out by the military. That's just true. It can't not be any other, it cannot be any other way. And then I say fighting, and I give some examples. Fighting against Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, etc. So I haven't necessarily tagged everything within the subpoint, but I'm planting these seeds, right? Trump and Russia talked, and that didn't work. We fight ISIS. There have been the United States Air Force has done airlifts. Israel needs to be defended. Like, these are already so many different examples that prove my point, and I'm just kind of throwing them in there. I'm not going into depth like the ping pong diplomacy or the Vietnam War example, where you're spending a full minute and a half on one example. I'm just being like, yeah, look, there's this argument over here. There's also over here, over here, over here. And I'm just pulling through a bunch of different arguments to support my side. And that's actually another thing I want to communicate in this video too. Make sure you have background information on all of this, because the more background information you have, the better equipped you will be to come up with witty and really amazing arguments when your judges are like, wow, I didn't consider that, he's right. How does this kid know so many things about the past when it comes to the United States military, right? Having these this background information is going to be really helpful. But yeah, this is the negative case that I came up with. We're talking about a moral argument. Military intervention is what creates the moral things in the world. It is what supports the moral actions taken by government, supporting people. And here's another thing I wanted to point out. You might argue, well, a lot of what you're talking about is safety, like fighting terrorism, giving aid. Like, a lot of that is talking about we're keeping people safe. And that is true. But part of safety, part of human dignity is safety. But the underlying idea that I'm talking about with this within this negative case is that because people are inherently valuable, therefore, a government needs to acknowledge that when they act. So the reason we're giving aid to people, the reason we're fighting terrorism is because we acknowledge the dignity of humans. We acknowledge the worthiness of humanity, and we want to support that. And that is why I'm saying that military intervention is what drives that. It is how we achieve supporting humanity across the globe, whether it be for your own nation or for another nation. But that's the negative case. This is what we're talking about here. This is something that I think is really strong, and you're going to see in the next video how we use this negative case to respond to the opponent's affirmative case, and of course the cross-examination questions that we would ask in order to set ourselves up and make our arguments even more potent. Because there's nothing better than an effective cross-examination. In fact, I tell the students that I coach and that I judge in debate rounds that cross-examination is kind of like the lifeblood of a debate round, and you need to be able to do it well and utilize the answers that you are given by your opponent. But I want to thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope it was helpful, and I want to let you know, feel free to use the arguments that I've talked about. What I'm really trying to do is inspire you and hopefully use my ideas as a catalyst to going on your own rabbit hole as you research the different types of diplomacy or military intervention, and think about these arguments on a deeper level. Because there's a reason that you wrote the case that you wrote. There's something in the case that you actively believe. And if you can acknowledge that, you can find some bits of passion and use that to your advantage to be credible, to evoke emotion, to have the ethos, pathos, and logos that we talked about in a past video. If you found this video to be helpful, please give it a like, and of course, again, consider subscribing. I'd appreciate the support. You can always reach out to me at coachmicahdiaz@gmail.com if you have any requests, questions, concerns, or if you want to book a session. I am open for the season, and I would love to work with you and help you as you begin your journey to either winning a tournament, winning an event, or winning the entire league this year. So, signing out. I hope you have an amazing week, and I will see you next time.